There we go. All right. Y'all don't know it, but when you come down here and talk to me, you're on the internet. So I've just started turning the speakers off to protect the innocent, of course, because the internet is forever. All right. Ephesians 5:25 or 22 and following, as we talked about, go ahead and put your hands down, is, I think, structurally an elaboration of verse number 21, right? Submitting yourselves to one another in the fear of God. We talked about what it means to submit yourselves to one another in the fear of God, the idea of serving, meeting the needs, and so on. And then we have these three different relationships that are discussed. There's husband and wife, there's parent and child, and there's slave and master. And so that's what we're working through right now. And we talked last week about, I guess we got through about verse 27 or 28 or so on. And what we're talking about is the fact that as we recognize the relationship between the husband and wife, as with any relationship, is a reciprocal relationship. There's a balance that is reached because each party has responsibilities. Each party to the relationship has a God-ordained role, and when one carries out their role to the best of their ability, then that makes it easier for the other, and so on and so forth. But the reverse is true as well. If one does not carry out their role as they should, it makes it more difficult for the other one to carry theirs out. So that needs to be remembered. The wife's responsibility, as it's laid out in Ephesians 5, is submitting and recognizing and supporting the headship, the authority, the leadership of her husband. The husband's responsibility, though, as we discussed last week, is to love his wife in a sacrificial way, in the same way that Christ loves the church. The wife submits to the husband in the way that the church submits to Christ. The husband loves the wife in the way that Christ loves the church. That's the balance that's reached in the context. And Paul will go on to describe how the husband has this responsibility to his wife to help meet her needs physically and spiritually and emotionally and whatever else there may be. So leadership carries with it a heavy responsibility, a heavy weight, and that's what he's talking about. I want you to notice what he says, though, when we get to verse 30 through 33, because now he sort of gets to the point of why he's saying this. He says, "For we are members of his body, of his flesh and of his bones. For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband." Well, verse 32 is sort of the key to this. What he's doing is he's letting us know that the purpose for this divine exposition between husband and wife and their responsibilities is really to paint a picture of the church and the relationship that the church has as the bride of Christ to Christ, right? And that would make sense, wouldn't it? Because after all, this is a book that's all about the church, and we have the doctrinal section in the first 3 chapters, and now we have the practical section. And the doctrinal section, we learned about how Jesus came to earth to die to establish the church, right? And so practically, here are the ways that we need to live and the things that we need to do in light of that. So one of the pieces of that puzzle is this relationship of love, but also submission and respect between Christ and the church that is mirrored by the husband and the wife. All right, next relationship, though, chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, is children and parents. "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training," or some translations say the nurture and admonition of the Lord. So again, this is a two-way street. It's a reciprocal relationship. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. All kind of discussion throughout the years about that term, in the Lord, and what does it mean. And if you ask me, It's much ado about nothing. The point here, like we see often throughout Scripture, is you obey your parents with only one exception, which is what?
When they're against God.
If they say it's right, if their desire is for you to do something that would contradict the will of God, then you're not under obligation to do it. That seems to be the meaning of it. But outside of that, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And then there is a quotation from Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 16, where Paul will say, Moses will say, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you. Well, I think the first part of that is clear enough, honor your father and mother, but what does it mean when he says, well, actually, let me stop for a minute. What does it mean, honor? What is the word honor?
I do respect.
Yeah, due respect, if you will. Respect or reverence for who they are and for the position that they hold. Again, we're elaborating on submitting to one another in the fear of God, 5:21, and so part of that is recognizing the role that each person plays in these different relationships. And the father, the parents, according to the Apostle Paul, are the ones that have the authority in the relationship over the children. So children, honor your parents. Now, just to add something to that, it's an interesting topic to study, in fact, because the honoring of the parents, as Scripture will describe it, is not something that has an expiration date. In other words, you don't grow to a point where you don't have to do that anymore. So in adulthood, for example, what that looks like, other than just an attitude of reverence and so on, is helping provide for their needs. Do you remember, you'll have to forgive me, the chapter and verse reference escapes me, but do you remember when Jesus confronted the Pharisees because they were not giving their temple tax as they should, and they said, it's Corban. Remember this? And the word Corban means it's set aside for the Lord, C-O-R-B-A-N. Well, the context of that is that they should have been taking care of their parents. The money should have been used to honor and to take care of the elderly parents who couldn't take care of themselves. And the Pharisees were saying, well, we can't use our money for that because it's Corban. It's set aside for the Lord, and Jesus will rebuke them for it. So this is a responsibility that is always ongoing, honoring parents. Now, the second part of this, that it's the first commandment with promise. What does that mean? Well, there's a couple of things. If you go back and look at the passages right under the Old Testament law, there's really a positive and a negative side of the promise. The promise was, children, obey your parents, or what? It involved rocks, big ones, and lots of them. Yeah, it was a capital punishment under the law of Moses for unruly children. Now, I'm sure that didn't mean an 8-year-old who was still learning, how to respect his parents. I imagine that probably had to do with an older child who well understood what he was doing, but had displayed an ongoing pattern of continual disrespect and dishonor. But the point for us to take from that is that it was a very serious matter. It continues to be a very serious matter. But the other side of the promise, is stated in verse number 3. What does he say? That you may live well and have a long life on the earth. Well, what do you suppose the correlation is between children obeying their parents or honoring their parents and also living well and having a long life on the earth?
Their parents probably taught them good health habits.
Well, that's probably part of it. Parents taught them good things that they need to have a good, successful life. That's part of it. What do you suppose the other is, Roger?
Well, I think there's a spiritual thing involved. You're gonna live well because you treated your parents well, which is God's will.
Yeah.
Which means you're respecting God too.
Sure.
And I want to add, honor your father and mother. That's till you die.
Sure. Yeah.
Your whole life.
Sure.
You honor them by how you live, and that's again honoring God till you die.
Sure.
What you say and how you respond
Sure.
Remember that.
Yep, that's a solid point. Let me just ask it this way, in a general way, because, if you think about it, there are general truths that apply to all of these different relationships. So let me just ask it this way. Does it ever generally go well for a person who is disrespectful to authority, whatever authority that may be? Is that a good way to live? Absolutely not. The consequences for that kind of an attitude are always negative. They're always bad. So children who would like to have an enjoyable life, the Bible says, ought to do what? They ought to respect the authority of their parents, the same way that employees ought to respect the authority of their employers, and the same way that citizens ought to respect the authority of the law enforcement, and so on. Because when you don't respect authority, bad things happen. That's the way that God has designed it. All right, we got to keep going. So husbands and wives, parents and children, and then we have verses 5 through 9, we have slaves or servants and masters. Now this is always an interesting subject to dig into for obvious reasons. So let me just make a couple of general observations about slavery in the first century world. This will be a reminder in some ways. So first you need to remember that it was very, very different than what we think about when we think about slavery, like before the Civil War in our country. It was not based on a person's race or skin color at all. It was not limited to any certain group of people. A person could sell themselves into slavery by their own voluntary will if they chose to do so to pay back a debt or something like that. There were slaves or servants who, over time, would earn money and would be able to purchase their own freedom. There were some slaves in the first century world, particularly the Roman world, that as they served in the household of a very wealthy person, their standard of living is actually much higher and better by doing that than they would be were they free, and then they would be poor. Because remember that in ancient Rome, you don't have the same situation like we have here, where you can pull yourself up from your bootstraps and get a good job and make a good life for yourselves and climb up the ladder. That didn't exist in that world. You pretty much were, in whatever station you were born, that was pretty much it, with few exceptions, right? There were some slaves in the Roman world that themselves owned slaves. There were some slaves or servants in the ancient world that did jobs that we look at now and we prize and value them highly. Okay, for example, Jesus has several parables where he'll talk about a steward, right? A servant or a steward of the house, a household manager. Most of the time that's a servant. And the owner of the house puts that servant in charge of all of the affairs. We have another word for that. We usually say something like a superintendent or a manager or maybe a foreman or something like that. Same kind of deal, same kind of situation. The only difference is that man was a servant or enslaved to the owner. It's also true that the Romans had laws that regulated slavery. Of course, that doesn't mean that all of them followed the law, but they did have laws that regulated it. And a lot more can be said about that, but I think that'll suffice. Just enough to recognize that it was a very different sort of a situation than what we think about when we talk about the subject and the term. Now, on the other side of that coin, you will notice that the New Testament will never come out and explicitly condemn it. It never comes out and explicitly condones it either. But what it does, as we discussed last week, is it changes that relationship and highlights the responsibilities that both servant and master have to one another. And so in doing that, it basically legislates it out of existence. All right, and the best example of that is the book of Philemon, where you remember that Onesimus is a slave who has run away from his master Philemon. Philemon is a Christian. Onesimus comes into contact with Paul at some point along the way, and he obeys the gospel. And so Paul writes the letter to Philemon, puts it in Onesimus' hand, and then sends him back. Now you'll notice that he never says anything in that letter about, how that relationship was sinful or anything like that. But what he does do is he tells Philemon that you have to receive him as a what? As a brother, right? So the relationship has changed. And then we have passages like the one that we're about to read, and Paul will talk about it also in Colossians, and Peter will have a couple of things to say about it. And the points that will be brought out here is that the servant and the master both have responsibilities to one another. The servant is to, have a respectful and obedient attitude, and he's to do all things heartily, and so on and so forth. But the master, on the other hand, is to treat him with respect and fairness and dignity and all of that. So this relationship is changed. And to apply that in a more modern sense, it looks a lot like an employer and employee relationship. But really, I think you can take the principles and you can apply that to any relationship or situation where you find yourself under the authority of somebody else, right? Well, I won't say everyone, because maybe you haven't experienced this, but a lot of people, most of us perhaps, know what it's like to have a job where the boss or the supervisor or whatever is just not a good person and is a really difficult man or woman to work for. You know what I'm talking about? Knows that they're in charge and really enjoys it, wants to make sure you know it too. One of those kind of people. Most of us understand what that's like. Well, how do you deal with something like that? What kind of attitude should you have? Well, that's where these passages come into play, right? So, a mirrored relationship, I think, between employer-employee, but in general, any situation where you find yourself in a position where you are subordinate to another one who is in authority, whatever that looks like. All right, now, what does it say? Bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and sincerity of heart, as to Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will, doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is slave or free. And you masters, do the same things to them, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master also is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. Now, I would say that the key here is verse number 8, where Paul says, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive from the Lord, whether slave or free. That is Paul's way of saying both the servant and the master will answer to the Lord. Just generally, right? We're all going to answer to the Lord, but to be a little more specific about it, the servant is going to answer to the Lord for how he carries out his role as a servant, but the master is going to answer to the Lord for how he carries out his role as the master as well. So the servant, he says in verse 5 and verse 6, have a responsibility to do what? Well, to have a good, obedient, respectful, and hardworking attitude. That's how I would summarize that. You obey, he says, verse 5. You do it with fear and trembling, with respect. You do it in sincerity of heart. You do it for the right reason. And you do it as to Christ. You notice in each one of these relationships, there's a connection to the Lord in some way. Husbands and wives. Wives submit as to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke them, right? Servants, serve your masters as if you were serving Christ. With the same kind of mentality, with the same kind of attitude. With goodwill, he says, doing the will of God from the heart. But masters do the same things to them. What do you think the things are? What are the same things? What's the things that he just mentioned? Isn't that interesting? Servants have a responsibility to submit and serve, but apparently masters have some degree of responsibility to submit and serve to them as well. What does that mean, submit? Well, I don't think it's authority, but it goes back to verse 21, right? Which has to do with sacrificing ourselves to serve and meet the needs of others. All right, so that gets us to verses 10 through 20. Which brings the book to a close, all right? And then we're going to talk about Galatians for the rest of our time because the calendar is against us. So now, if you're following through, we have in this last section of the book, in this last half, we have Ephesians 4 verse 1, which tells us that we need to live our lives in a way that is worthy of the gospel, that measures up. And then there are a number of different things that Paul says need to be done. Here's what that means. Pursuing unity is one thing, right? Pursuing a newness of mind, a new way of thinking. That's the second that he starts in chapter 4, about verse number 17. Walking in love, chapter 5. Walking in light, chapter 5, verse 1. Walking in love, chapter 5, verse 11. Walking in light. Walking in wisdom, chapter 5, verse 16. And then we have this discussion about how we're to interact with one another. And all three of these, husband, wife, parent, child, slave, and master, are characterized by respect and service. Every one. They're still positions of authority. Each one has an authority figure. But the authority figure has responsibilities to those under the authority, and the ones under the authority have responsibilities to the authority figure. It's a reciprocal situation. Now, with all of that said, to bring the whole book to a close, Paul will say, "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil, because we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." Verse 10, when Paul says, "Be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might," notice that there is an emphasis here. Where is the strength and the might coming from? Is it coming from me? No. Who's it coming from? It's coming from the Lord. That's right. And the grammar of this passage in the original language is passive, which means something like this: allow yourselves to be strengthened with the might that the Lord has, or allow yourselves to be strengthened in the power of the Lord's might. Well, that begs a question, doesn't it? Like, how does that happen? Well, Paul answers it in the next verse. Put on the whole armor of God, so that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. So he answers his question. And the answer is, the way that God will strengthen you, the way that you can put on his might, is by putting on his armor. Now notice, God doesn't put the armor on for you. You have to put it on. God provides it. It's his might. It's his armor. But you put it on. And then there's a reason, he says, so that we may be able to stand or withstand against the wiles of the devil. The word wiles probably is better translated methods. You know, sometimes we illustrate, when we preach about the devil, we illustrate it by talking about how the devil has a toolbox or a tackle box or something like that, and that he has all these different tools that he can use. Well, that's where this comes from. Paul says that the devil has a lot of different methods. He has a lot of different means of approaching and trying to accomplish his desires. Well, how do you stand against them? How do you fight against them? Well, by allowing God to strengthen you by putting on the armor that God has provided. That is important because we're fighting against the devil, and then verse 12 is an elaboration. This is not a physical battle, he says, not a physical warfare. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood. It's a spiritual warfare. He says we wrestle or we fight against the principalities and powers and the rulers of the darkness of this age and spiritual wickedness in heavenly places. That's an elaborate way of simply saying this is a spiritual battle and we are fighting against the forces of evil. So, in verse 13 then, take up the whole armor of God so that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. Or the idea is something like this. Look, I'm telling you that you need to allow yourself to be strengthened. I'm telling you that you do that by putting on the armor God has provided. I'm telling you, Paul says, that the reason for that is that we are engaged in a very important spiritual battle. And so now, in this passage, verse number 13, he's saying, get to it. Do all of the work, do all of the preparation that you need to do so that you will be able to stand. That's the idea of how it ends there, having done all, to stand, right? All right, well, what does it include? Verses 14 and following. Well, it has the truth around the waist, the breastplate of righteousness, your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace, the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, and the sword of the Spirit. And this is accompanied always with prayer, with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, being watchful to this end with all perseverance and supplication for the saints. Now, we don't have the time to look at every one of these in particular, but I do want to point this out because it's always stood out to me as something that's interesting. You know, every one of these components of the armor of God in some way or another has some tie to the gospel message. I've always found that to be interesting for a number of reasons. But just staying in the book of Ephesians, I find that to be interesting because remember that back in Ephesians 4, Paul mentioned, as he talked about the 7 ones of unity, that there's one faith, right? There's one system of teaching, one system of faith. And that system of teaching or system of faith will tell us all about what God has done for us in chapters 1 through 3, and it'll tell us all about how God expects us to live for Him in light of that in chapters 4 through 6. And so it shouldn't surprise us then that when we get to the part where Paul says, all right, here's how you defend yourself in trying to do all of this, that he'll still be, at least in some way, talking about that one system of faith or that one system of teaching. It convicts us, it educates us, it changes us, but it also helps to defend us. All right, so that is the book of Ephesians in a nutshell, and we got to move on. My apologies. Let's talk about Galatians. The first thing that you need to do, or that you need to recognize when talking about the book of Galatians, after I check my clock here, okay? The first thing that you need to do when you're thinking about the book of Galatians is actually not turn to Galatians, but turn to Acts chapter 13. Because Acts 13, 14, and 15 will lay the foundation for what this book is all about. This is one of Paul's earlier books. It is probably written somewhere in the neighborhood of 53 to 58 AD, something like that. And what you will notice in Acts chapters 13 and 14 is, if you look on maybe a map in the back of your Bible and follow where Paul's going, that is the record of his work in southern Galatia, in the province of Galatia. And so as you read through those chapters, you will notice that Paul goes to various Gentile cities, and he preaches the gospel, and people obey the gospel, and the church is established, and so on. Acts 13 and 14. But then there's a problem in Acts chapter 15, verses 1 through 3. And you'll notice that verse 1 begins with a conjunction, right? Like we're continuing the thought. 13 through 15 go together. And certain men came down from Judea and taught the brethren, unless you were circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. All right, let's stop there just for a moment. First of all, you've heard the term perhaps Judaizing teacher. We use that term sometime, or Judaizer, something like that. Well, this is the biblical definition of a Judaizing teacher or a Judaizer. Acts 15:1. What are they teaching? They are teaching that unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot what? You cannot be saved, right? Okay, so They are not just saying, you must be circumcised. They are saying, you have to be. Otherwise, you cannot what? You cannot go to heaven. You cannot be right with God. All right, so that's a Judaizing teacher. What they're doing is they are taking parts of the law of Moses and they're taking the gospel and they're trying to put them together. And Paul will say in Galatians chapter 1 that what they've done is they've created something completely different, something completely new. Now, he says they came down from Judea and they taught the brethren. Well, they came down to where and they taught what brethren? They came down to the areas of Galatia in 13 and 14 and they taught the Galatian or the Gentile brethren that Paul converted in those 2 chapters. And they evidently did it very quickly, very soon. That's kind of the tenor of the book of Galatians. It's one of kind of shock and awe at the speed at which these things had taken place. So that basically is the background problem in a nutshell for the book of Galatians. Paul has preached the gospel to these Gentile brethren, and they have obeyed it. And then the Jews have come, certain have come from Judea, and they have taught, well, you have to obey the law of Moses. Well, that's not true. All right, now a couple of questions. Number one, what would motivate, do you suppose, certain Jews from Judea to come to Galatia or anywhere else for that matter and try to impose portions of the law of Moses on these Gentile brethren? What do you suppose would motivate them to do it?
The fact that they didn't believe in Jesus.
Well, maybe, Betty, but I don't know that that's quite it.
Not understanding the New Testament, not understanding the Christian.
Yeah, not completely understanding the system. I think that's probably right. Well, let me show you something. I want you to look at the end of the book of Galatians. This is important. Galatians 6, verses 11 and 12. Actually, just verse 12 and 13. And this is the answer. As many as desire to make a good showing in the flesh, these would compel you to be circumcised, only that they may not suffer persecution for the cross of Christ. For not even those who are circumcised keep the law, but they desire to have you circumcised, that they may boast in your flesh. There's the answer. What was the motivation of the Judaizers in going to try and convince the Gentile brethren that they needed to be circumcised? Well, they did not want to be persecuted. Now, here's where my mind goes with that. Paul does not say this, all right? So I'm just drawing what I think is a reasonable inference, and so mark it down that way, and you chew on it and take it for what it's worth. As you study through the book of Acts and you focus on the persecution that the church endured in the book of Acts, the majority of that came not from the Gentiles, not from the Romans, but from the Jews, the unbelieving Jews. Often, when the Romans are involved in persecuting the church, it's because some unbelieving Jew went and stirred the Roman magistrate up and caused it to happen. So, what I'm thinking is going on here is that you have brethren that are in Judea, in Jerusalem perhaps. And here are some brethren who have obeyed the gospel, but the problem is that they're still getting a lot of pressure and a lot of persecution and abuse from their Jewish brethren. You know, the ones that maybe they see every day when they go to the town square, when they go to the marketplace or whatever. So, what could a Jewish Christian, particularly one who might be a Pharisee or might be one who's wealthy, what can a Jewish Christian do to ride the fence and be a Christian, but also kind of tamper down the pressure a little bit from all of his friends and co-workers who were unbelieving Jews? Well, he can try to bring the two of them together. You see, because if we convince these Gentile Christians to be circumcised according to the law of Moses, and if we go a little further than that, let's say, and we convince them also to perhaps be kosher, right? Now, we can take away the sort of ritual and ceremonial uncleanness, and our being Christians and our spending time with other Gentiles will not be quite as offensive to the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and all of the other Jewish elite in Jerusalem that we interact with on a regular basis. In my mind, that's how all this works out. But like I say, I'm just drawing a bit of an inference here. Now, adding to that, as you go through the book of Galatians, what you're going to find is that these Judaizing teachers, they not only taught this false doctrine, but they also attacked the Apostle Paul. It's pretty clear in the first couple of chapters that what these brethren were doing is what these Judaizers were doing is they're trying to convince these Galatian saints that Paul is really not who he says he is, that he is a lesser apostle, and that his gospel is really not the one you need to be listening to. Rather, they're trying to convince them the real apostles are like Peter and James and John and the brethren in Jerusalem. And the folks that you need to be listening to are the ones that come to Jerusalem. So what Paul will do in the first couple of chapters is he will defend his gospel and he will defend his apostleship. And he will do that in a number of different ways. But basically, the argument that he will make is, I am just as much an apostle as the original 12. We are not preaching a different gospel. We are preaching the same gospel. The only difference is that I do my work primarily among the Gentiles, and Peter does his work primarily among the Jews, and that's it. That's the only difference, right? Yeah, Alice.
Okay, all right. If they're working with two different groups, then how come they, why are they trying to make themselves, they're apostles, yes, but I thought there for a while that the Gentile wasn't part of the Old Testament too.
Well, all of the apostles are working together. The only difference is that Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles, so he does the majority of his work with Gentiles, and Peter does the majority of his amongst Jews. But that's it. They're preaching the same thing. They're on the same team, if you will. But evidently, these Judaizing teachers were trying to convince the brethren in Galatia that that was not true. And I know that because of the amount of time that Paul will spend arguing for it in the first two chapters. He wouldn't argue for it if it wasn't a problem, right? Okay. So, the primary issue in Galatia is trying to take the law of Moses and merge it together with the gospel of Christ, and that won't work. The Judaizers are the ones who are responsible for that. The reason why they're doing it, according to Paul, is because they don't want to be persecuted themselves. Now, he doesn't tell us exactly why they're being persecuted. We can only try and make an educated guess. And my educated guess is that they're getting pressure from unbelieving Jews that they would like to have a good relationship with, and the only way that they feel like they can soften that is by forcing Judaism on these Gentile Christians. But be that as it may, we know for sure that they don't want to be persecuted. Part of the way that they choose to go about this is by denigrating the Apostle Paul and the work that he's done among them. Don't listen to him. He is not an authentic apostle. His gospel is not authentic. Listen to us because we come from Jerusalem and we know Peter and James and John. Therefore, we're the authorities. That's how they're presenting it. So in this book, you will have, there's 6 chapters, 3 different sections. Chapters 1 and 2 is an autobiographical section or a personal section. Chapters 3 and 4 is a doctrinal section. And chapters 5 and 6 is a practical section. And we'll have to start on that, Lord willing, next Sunday. All right, appreciate your attention and participation.